Digital platforms emerged with the promise to remove intermediaries and bottlenecks that would provide new economic opportunities. But with these platforms emerged unforeseen challenges. The Buck Stops with Platforms panel on Social Media Summit 2021 will deliberate if there is a need to regulate platforms and discuss whether platforms are above accountability.
Social media platforms have taken the world by storm. They worked around the ancient rules and regulations, and they've had a free rein thus far. But the time to redistribute power is now. The time for responsibility is now. The time for accountability is now. Today, the brightest minds, the biggest ideators, the social media movers and shakers come together on the Social Media Summit to deliberate on the buck stops with platforms.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Social Media Summit organized by Republic TV. It's a great pleasure to be here. The topic that we're going to debate and discuss today would be the buck stops with platforms. And by platforms, we obviously mean the social media platforms. It's a very interesting debate, and I'm really delighted to have as my co-panelists Ms. N.S. Napinai. She is a Supreme Court advocate and founder of Cyber Sathi. Welcome, Ms. Napinai. We have Ms. Lizzie O'Shea. She is a digital rights activist, human rights lawyer, and a writer. And last but certainly not the least, we have Dada Kanchan Gupta. He is a senior advisor, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Government of India. So let me begin with Ms. Lizzie O'Shea and ask her views on this topic. Ms. Shea, over to you.
So I think it is fair to say that social media platforms, the well-known social media platforms, are some of the most powerful corporations in the world, and grappling with how to regulate them is something that lots of countries of the world, around the world, are doing. I think that they do need to be regulated, but I come at this from the perspective of users and citizens' rights. And I think human rights need to be protected in the regulation of social media platforms. And so I don't think regulation should be in support of censorship, should be to turn these social media platforms into places of oppression. So that means that in any regulation, we have to make sure that privacy is protected and large amounts of user data are not kept by companies and certainly not then passed on to government. We need to make sure freedom of expression is protected and that these social media platforms are a place to facilitate public discussion and a place in which dissent can take place. So I'm very concerned about the new laws that were passed in February, which really encourage internet platforms, particularly social media platforms, to preemptively over-censor content and avoid dissent coming to the fore. I think they impose too much power on social media companies themselves to stand in the way of users making use of these platforms to facilitate discussion and to hold those in power to account. I think it's very problematic if we create an environment where social media platforms hold a huge amount of data on behalf of their users, which can then be used by law enforcement as a tool of surveillance. And I think it's very important in that sense to also protect anonymity and the rights of individual people in specific categories like journalists and human rights defenders to have the right to be able to have conversations without being surveilled and without their identity being traced. And so my view is that we need to protect human rights, both as against social media platforms, but also as against government.
Right, thanks very much. Kanchanda, how about you? What are your views as far as the platforms and the buck stopping with the platforms are concerned?
So in India, what we are right now, what we are doing is we are revisiting and relooking at platforms and intermediaries. Primarily because intermediaries have now ceased to be intermediaries in the classical sense and as they were defined at one point of time. So these are not intermediaries anymore. They have now become platforms. And therefore, there has to be a certain amount of responsibility and accountability which attaches to the platforms. Now, you have referred to social media platforms. There, the responsibility and accountability becomes much more heightened because access is easy, access is free, and governments primarily have a responsibility to maintenance of law and order. They have a responsibility to ensure that there is adherence to sovereign laws and rules, and there has to be a certain amount of explanatory accountability which attaches to these platforms, including grievance redressal. Now, the platform rules which have been introduced are aimed at addressing these issues, and it all hinges around. Now, if you look at each of these social media platforms, whether it is Twitter or Facebook or WhatsApp, whatever, now they must comply, and Google also, YouTube. So they must comply with India's laws, India's regulations, and not rules which are framed in the corporate headquarters of these platforms. And that is where the friction is now increasingly coming up. We have seen this happen in Germany. We have seen this happen in Brazil. In Australia, they had a huge standoff on redefining platforms because Google was redefined as a media platform, news platform, and therefore taxable. So in India, we are also facing a certain amount of resistance. The platforms do not wish to be accountable to the government of India, nor do they wish to be in compliance with rules, regulations, and laws as framed by the sovereign government of India. Now, the problem, therefore, becomes one of how to ensure compliance and how to ensure that sovereign laws prevail over corporate laws, and why intermediaries cannot and must not be allowed to seek refuge behind this behind the wall called intermediary, that as an intermediary I am not accountable or responsible. Sorry, it no longer works like that. You have chosen to become a platform, and you have chosen to become a platform because you are also deciding content, which content to be allowed, which content is not to be allowed, whom to be cancelled, who is not to be cancelled, who is to be barred for life, who is not to be barred for life. And if you are going to assume such discretionary power, you automatically lose the status of an intermediary, and as a platform, you become answerable to the government. So there are two parts: the redefining intermediaries as platforms, and also ensuring that there is compliance with sovereign laws and rules.
Right. Thanks very much, Dada, for that very succinct opening remark from you. Ms. Napinai, over to you. Your opening remarks, please.
Thank you, Anand. I have kind of like slightly modified the topic to say the buck stops with the platform with a detour. And the reason why I say with a detour is that whenever we speak about intermediaries, the first thing that comes to everybody's mind, and what Kanchanda just spoke about also, is the exemptions or the safe harbor that accrues to the benefit of social media platforms. And consequently, there is an automatic assumption that there is no responsibility or liability that accrues to them. That is not really the case legally speaking. So in law, the exemption comes with many strings attached, and hence my addition of the detour part of it. So the detour may be that the buck may detour away from a social media platform, but ultimately lands right square and back into the platform, for liability or responsibility. So when we look at the whole gamut of what is the kind of responsibility that law envisages for a social media platform, be it in terms of user protection, be it in terms of non-intervention, assuming their continued safe harbor, be it in terms of cooperation with the law enforcement authorities, be it in terms of retention of information or data or evidence, and cooperation during investigation. So a lot, and of course, what we have been seeing a lot of over the last few months, which pertain to blocking of certain kinds of content, interceptions or monitoring of content, and the ways and means for it. And the last part of the debate, which is still ongoing and now before courts, on traceability or otherwise. So when you look at it from the perspective of even at the very basic threshold of responsibility, to the higher end of the threshold in terms of accountability to government agencies or to courts, etc., most of the time, or possibly always, you will find that the buck indeed stops with the platform. Now, what is the rationale behind it? Some parts of it has already been discussed, and that's, and both the interventions to begin with have already set out the two extreme levels of the spectrum. One is to balance out free speech and expression, and the other is to ensure sovereign rights and regulating and compliance with the regulation. Yeah. So that compliance also falls within the array of the social media platform, which becomes the intermediary not just between multiple users, but also consequently between the government agency and the user possibly. So this is why, in fact, in my book, I have called it the Trishanku Swarga, or the heaven, which is neither here nor there, yes. Where, the intermediaries assumed that with the safe harbor protections that they had, they possibly assumed that here is something that gives us a free pass to do whatever we want. But unfortunately, that's not how law pans out. With some of the additions that have come in India, I'm not going into the controversial aspects right now, but just the basic compliance aspects. What you will see is that not only as an assumption as it was earlier, but as a very definitive requirement, the buck has fair and square fallen within the court of all the social media platforms for them to comply with. And be it in terms of the appointment of a compliance officer or a grievance officer and what is required of them, the timeline within which they have to act or react, all of it is now set out, and that makes it quite explicit.
I think all your points are absolutely valid, all of you, but as far as I'm concerned, I think it is my belief, has been for a very long time, since I can remember, that a social media platform cannot censor, ban, adjudicate, publish, alter, or editorialize. I mean, I have no issues when it remains a platform. That is, it does not control what trains come and go. But that's not the case anymore, is it? These platforms heavily censor what they please, ban what they don't like, and these are all subjective decisions based on ideology or political preferences. So any social media platform operating in India should have just one rule, just one. Anything you post here is subject to Indian laws and can be acted upon never by us, but by Indian courts. Anything more, I believe, is an instrument of control and prone to bias. It's that simple. Look, I mean, the fact is that our constitution doesn't guarantee absolute freedom of expression. it has spawned laws that are draconian and subjective and tailor-made for misuse. But in the scenario that a platform doesn't conform to absolute freedom of expression, and we've seen it doesn't, I believe that a monopoly of bias in a democracy should rest with the constitution, not the platform. I'd much rather a judge ban me than a platform. So Facebook or Twitter or any other social media platform cannot decide or editorialize. They should just be platforms. In fact, they were all platforms initially when they sucked in consumers. But once they trapped consumers, they kept on changing and adding terms and rules. And now they are a law unto themselves. And Twitter is but an extension of the modern, deeply polarized society. And, to be honest, this isn't objectionable. Because polarization means you have a clash of ideas, that there is competition among them. And so it mirrors Darwinian evolution. Science, religion, capitalism, communism, right wing, left wing, Modi, Rahul, Kangana, Swara. There's nothing wrong in professing diametrically opposite likes or dislikes and views, even if you hold entrenched views. But the problem comes when one party, one ideology, one dogma, one system controls the discourse or weighs in on it. That's when you stop being a platform and start to editorialize and play God. Because knowing Twitter, even Facebook, even selecting what to flag, what not to, is a totally subjective decision. Let me give you one example. Let's say that I tweet, the earth was formed in 6 days and the man created from black mud. Now science tells us that obviously this is an absolute total lie. So should Twitter flag it as fake and withhold my tweet? But these are verses from the Holy Book, 754, 1526. What if the fact checker at Twitter adjudicating on my tweets was deeply religious and actually believed my tweets to be true? Would he disregard science and pass on my tweets? Or what if he was an atheist like me or a scientist? Would he flag my tweet and ask for it to be deleted? Bottom line is, any platform enabling a discourse cannot play God or atheist, because then it becomes an echo chamber. And if it does, that's where the diversity ends, mutations stall, mixing is prevented, and evolution shut down. So I think this is the basic gist of what I want to say here. Now we can open it up. And when I do, I want to start with a thought experiment, and I want to begin with Kanchanda, because Kanchanda, you're a senior advisor to Ministry of I&B, so I think you're at the right person to ask this. Let's do a thought experiment. When you said that, and I have also said this, that any platform should conform to the rules of the country it is operating in. So let's take a thought experiment. Let's talk about, let's say, a dictatorial regime, let's say China, and it's 1 billion odd people that you want to tell the truth to the world as to what is happening in dictatorial China. So would you want, if Twitter was operating in China, of course it's not, but if it was, it's a thought experiment, would you want the Chinese people there, to be, who are already subject to draconian laws, would you want Twitter also to be subject to those draconian laws, i.e. the people who are using Twitter in China? Would you want them not to be able to tell the truth about the things that are happening in China? Because that is what it would be if the platform operating in China is subject to the laws of China.
So Anand, unfortunately, that is how the world works, the real world. So today, if you are going to go China to do business in China, you would be governed by Chinese laws. So even if you were an American investor, you would not be governed by American laws, you would be governed by Chinese laws. Anybody else who goes to China, even if you go on a tourist visa to China, you would still be governed by Chinese laws. If you were a journalist working out of China, you would be governed by Chinese laws. So unfortunately, we may not like the laws of China, and there are a lot of people who do not like the laws of India. Now, there are a lot of people who do not like the laws of America. But it's not a question of what we like or what we do not like. It is a question of the principle behind it. And as I mentioned in my opening statement, the principle is very simple. If you are operating in India, you have to be governed and you have to be in compliance with laws, rules, and regulations as framed by the sovereign government of India. Now, I will just give you, and also you think, we should not really confuse and conflate the two. An intermediary gets a certain amount of protection because an intermediary says that I am just the intermediary. I am just the place where people are coming and parking their views or whatever. But a platform becomes one where the owners of the platform or the managers of the platform are regulating what can be said over there, what cannot be said over there, who can talk over there, and who cannot talk over there. Therefore, more than an intermediary, it is the platform which becomes sort of really accountable and responsible. The other point which I would like to say that I did not mention in my opening remarks, I did not mention the word regulation. One of the panelists mentioned that the government of India is talking of regulation. The government of India is not talking of regulation. The government of India is talking of compliance. Compliance and regulation are two different words, and there's a nuanced difference between the two. Now, coming back to the question that whether we should accept the overriding powers of sovereign laws, yes, we must and we should. I mean, just as an American entity which does business in India, any one of their software companies, they are governed by Indian laws of taxation, Indian laws of industrial code, everything that needs to be enforced is enforced. So why should an exemption be given to Twitter or YouTube or Facebook or Instagram or Google, any of these platforms? I mean, that would be an absurd, unsustainable exemption. And lastly, you have rightly touched on the point that the Constitution of India, and this is on the specific aspect of free speech, the Constitution of India does not provide for unrestricted speech. It provides for free speech, but not unrestricted speech. And we could debate that separately, whether that's a good idea, bad idea, but that's how it is right now. And now I will give you, to make this point, I will just give you an example. Now, one of the platforms may find it perfectly acceptable to live broadcast a cow being slaughtered, or women being whipped, or child pornography, or whatever. Now, then what does the government of India do? Because these are things, not only the government of India, in some instances it would be the government of India, in other instances it would be largely all governments around the world. How do they deal with it? Because there is a fallout of that. There is a law and order fallout of that. There is a social fallout of that. There is a political fallout of that. And linked to that is the increasing proclivity of these platforms to sort of intervene in the political process of countries.
Okay. Yeah.
So you have to keep that in mind also.
Ms. Oshia, are platforms supposed to be for public good? If they are, let me extend the question that I asked to Kanchanda here. Let's say it's a Tibetan activist in China who wants to expose the draconian aspects of, the Chinese government in controlling freedom of speech and expression and all sorts of things, stomping on individual rights. But if he uses a platform that is conforming to the laws of China, he will not be able to use that platform as a public good. He'll not be able to inform the world that wants to know about what is happening to him, a Tibetan activist in China. So are you for the platforms following the laws of the land in which they operate? Or are you for the platforms being just platforms and acting as a public service, a public good?
I think it's a great question, and it gets to the nub of this debate because I'm not sure it is as simple as compliance with the law, in part because laws always need to be interpreted by courts, so there's always some uncertainty about their limits and the like. But I think what is clear is that when it comes to platforms, it's much more about power. I think most social media platforms know when they operate in a particular country that they are there only really while they hold the trust of government. And that's true in places like China, that's true in India, that's also true in places like Australia. So if you're not prepared to hold the government in good standing, be in good standing with the government, you may face difficulties continuing to operate. And so the question then becomes, what do we think about that? Do we think it's okay for platforms to cooperate with government to do bad things to dissidents, to journalists, to human rights advocates, and then hide behind a defence that they're complying with the law when we know that this is really about power? I think a lot of social media platforms will preemptively censor content to please the government of the country that they're in. So they will not just comply with the bare limits of the law, they'll often go far beyond it to ensure that the political establishment is happy with their conduct. I think social media platforms do exist in a very important and particular space. They are a special kind of company because they offer the social infrastructure of the web. They allow people to come together. They allow people to have discussions and debates. They allow people to see what their elected representatives are doing in their name and to hold them to account, and to hold them to account when they break their promises or they do things that they're not happy with. That's a particular role that they play. I have problems with the fact that they are private companies that owe obligations to shareholders, but I also have a problem with the social infrastructure of the web being subject to the interests of governments, because I think that's not what it should be. I think it should be a place for facilitating democracy, which can be messy, it can be uncomfortable, it involves dissent and discussion, and it should be a place in which that happens. And I think social media platforms have an obligation to protect that. I did just want to add one thing, which is that I think it's fair to say that human rights as a concept doesn't require that any right is held to be absolute. Part of the practice of human rights law is that, of course, rights will be in conflict. And, of course, there's occasions where rights need to be infringed for a particular purpose. The question is that necessary and proportionate? And how are we looking after people who might be harmed? And that's where I come at this, from everyday people who might be expressing dissent, who might be in a victimised minority, being able to be represented and heard on social media platforms, being able to expose injustice. And that means that social media platforms themselves need to do the right thing, and governments shouldn't be using social media platforms as tools of oppression and surveillance. And if I think India is at a bit of a crossroads here. Does it want to be the world's biggest democracy, or does it want to go down an authoritarian path? And that's a very important choice that I think the people should be able to make. And social media platforms are one place in which that discussion can happen.
Yeah, thanks. If I can add something to that before I put that question to Ms. Napinai, because I think it's quite interesting. We've come to the core of the issue. As Ms. Oshia says that there is a possibility, in fact, it's a reality that the social media companies are out to please the governments. I would add to that in asking this question to Ms. Napinai that I think they are also not only out to please the governments, they're out to please the so-called woke people, or their consumers. And in that is why they are adjudicating, they are regulating, they are censoring, because when they censor an opposing view, they're in fact helping out and pleasing the people who are opposed to that view, and they might be in millions. And we see that across the political divide, across the ideological divide. Just to give you one example. For example, in America, it is not a crime to burn a holy book. It is not. But in Sweden, in Australia, it is. The blasphemy law doesn't exist, but you would be arrested if you were to burn the holy book of a very prominent religion. Would Twitter allow you to post a video of you burning that book? It didn't in Sweden, even though the law did not exist. And I dare say it wouldn't in America as well. You remember when one person said, I'm going to burn the holy book, the president of America came on national television and pleaded with him, please don't do so. So if the president would have those views, not allowing, pleading with the person to not express his freedom of expression, if I may say so, then what chance do social media companies have? So I think it's a bit of both. They're trying to please sometimes the governments, but more often than that, they're trying to please the people of the same ideology. Would you agree with that, Napinai? And for that very reason, there should not be any regulation or any editorializing of a platform.
I would say that social media platforms are actually just pleasing themselves. I think anybody who thinks that they are actually taking a lot of effort to please somebody else may be sadly mistaken, right? It may just be incidental that it may please a particular group or the other, but as I just said, it may just be incidental. But Anand, you took a kind of, some of the thoughts right out of my mind in a way. When you put the thought experiment to Kanchanda, the equivalent that crossed my mind was this. The majority of this panel is from India. So when we talk about jaywalking, we would look quizzically at each other because we would say, what is the big deal about it? Right? Because in most of the times, we don't have a platform to walk on, because where there are platforms also, that may be congested with hawkers, etc. Right? So walking on the road is our right in India. But I can tell you, I was in the southernmost part of Scotland late in the night, and because a local told us that jaywalking is not permissible, we still waited for the light to turn on, meaning to light to turn green for us to cross the road late in the night.
Yes.
So the thought experiment that you put forth is very interesting, but it actually begs the obvious. One, that whether we like it or not, territoriality dictates, and territoriality and sovereignty, I would say, dictates the rights of sovereign nations to decide the laws within those parameters, within those boundaries, right? And for people or entities to have to comply with it. Where you repeated often about fundamental rights of including of free speech or expression not being absolute in India, that's correct. But I just wanted to qualify it to say, when we talk about restrictions on fundamental rights, they have to be reasonable restrictions. What I'm leading to is this, that one, yes, a social media platform has to comply with the law, and where they believe that the law may be excessive, that it violates the Constitution of India, it is not for the platform to decide what they will or will not do. If they decide and jaywalk, then they have to face the consequences of it, which may be punitive, right? The alternative for them to do without violating the law would be to contest the law then, and let a court decide whether the law is excessive or not. But we can't take law into our own hands to decide whether something is constitutional or violative of it, and whether we will agree with it or not. If there is a law for jaywalking, we comply with it. That's the crux of it.
No, you're right in many ways. In fact, Kanchanda and Ms. Oshia and you're all right, because when you talk about laws, there are laws, but I'm talking of human rights and activisms and freedom of speech. And there, I think if a government or a particular land and its laws are severely restricting, it's actually hindering the public good, the help that one might give to the human rights activists of that country that is oppressing. Just to give you one example, when you talk about there is no absolute freedom of expression, rightly you say so. I think to sum it up, what the overarching view of all of us was that there are the laws of the land, and if the common citizens of that country are following those laws, then these social media platforms should also follow those laws. I am a bit reluctant on that because of the precise reasons that I elucidated and the thought experiments that I put forth. But having said that, because I believe that the social media platforms currently are a law unto themselves, they are not following absolute freedom of expression. Under those circumstances, as I said, they should be following the law of the land. If they were for absolute freedom of expression, if they weren't editorializing, if they weren't banning or censoring, then it's a different kettle of fish, hence that thought experiment. So I think we leave that with the viewers and the listeners, and it's been a wonderful discussion. I thank all my fellow panelists and the Republic TV for having this wonderful debate. Thank you so much. Thank you.